It is 6:02, so we're going to begin our class. Welcome, everyone. This lesson is lesson 7 on pruning. It is the second to last class for this certification program. It is the penultimate class. That is a word that means second to last or next to last. Penultimate. I learned that as a child and never forgot it. We are going to start by doing a homework review. Most of you chose the option of discussing or identifying some either pest or potential pathogen issue in a landscape, either that you attend or your own personal landscape or one that you found, and running kind of that diagnostic process through the UC IPM website and coming up with some possible issues. And some of you were able to narrow it down to potentially 1 or 2 or 3 options, which was really great. So we're going to do a little bit of that homework review before we get into the pruning, because I think the pest and disease subject is quite exciting. Yay, pests and pathogens. Emily, yours is right in the front. All right, so let me get the view a little better. All right. So pests and pathogens, I kind of thank you very much for those of you, the majority of you sent your homework in with ample time for me to kind of put together a little slideshow. So if you like that we get to discuss it and actually look at it, then you know, that's thanks to those of you who submitted the homework with time to spare, especially if you sent it yesterday. So I was able to do this before class and gather a few examples of people's both photos and also their thought process and with regards to what they were looking at. So number 1 here, we have Toyon, Heteromeles arbutifolia, which is a shrub, also called Christmas berry. And so this is being grown in the Tree People nursery. So nursery settings have a slightly different kind of environment than a landscape setting. And so this, for instance, having used the diagnostic tool, the website suggested potential Phytophthora, right? So Phytophthora would be a bad one. However, this nursery happens to be the second out of 2 nurseries in Southern California being certified as phytosanitary nurseries, meaning that they go through very, very strict sanitation protocols to exclude Phytophthora specifically. So the likelihood is very, very slim that Phytophthora would be the reason for this discoloration of the leaves. But as regardless, they're still going to test for that. But the other options are scab and entomosporium leaf spot. And both of those are caused by damp conditions from rain and overhead irrigation. So if you think about what a nursery setting has to be, the plants are irrigated much more frequently than in the landscape. When they're little babies, they have to be irrigated a lot more often. And so the supposed remedy for that might be to convert to a system of irrigation that is not overhead, but that's not really realistic in this nursery. So there isn't really a way to avoid the overhead watering in this context. But to move the plants out of the main batch, the ones that are affected by this leaf spot, removing them from the group, quarantining them separately so that potential spores are not splashing onto healthy neighboring little seedlings, that's a really good management strategy. All right, so next, this one is very, very fun. So we talked about Manzanita leaf galls in the class. That was an example of it. And this is a wonderful set of photos that one of the students submitted. You can see on the left that the leaf galls, they're usually bright red. They are on the ends of the leaf. This is a Howard McMinn manzanita, and it tends to get pretty gally. The leaf gall aphid, I guess, is the insect itself. So what they do is they kind of burrow into the leaf and adapt the leaf to be this basically a nest so that they can breed, and they just use the leaf as their nest. And so there's really nothing to do about it. You can see when the gall was opened, you can see the insects themselves coming out. They don't really harm the plant. They rarely, if ever, cause any kind of fatality to the shrub, and so it's really not worth doing anything about it. If you really can't stand it, you could pinch off the leaves just the way this one was pinched off. You can pinch off the leaves that are affected with it and throw them away. But it's really not worth any kind of particular management. And in contrast, sometimes the bright red is actually quite attractive or interesting, and it adds some visual interest. So some people actually prefer the ones that have the galls. It's not that it's a beneficial thing necessarily, but it's certainly not rarely, if ever, really detrimental to the plant. So the solution to this particular pest issue: do nothing. Yeah, there's really nothing to do about it that is particularly beneficial to the plant. All right, so next. Oops, didn't want to do that. Oh my gosh, stop it. All right, so next we've got a couple images from the Westwood Greenway. We have on the left some plants, in particular an apricot mallow that seems to have died from overwatering is what is suspected. And why do we suspect that? Because there's actually a drip line that kind of runs in a circle around the crown of that plant. And we know that the irrigation strategy at that space is currently at the frequent irrigation. So they tend to do it more than one time in a week for a mature drought tolerant plant that is certain death, and usually in the form of a root rot. And so many Phytophthora pathogens, that genus is pretty likely to be the suspect for something that is rotting the roots. It's not the only one, but it's probably highly likely. And on the right, we have aphids on native milkweed. And so we talked a little bit about aphids and how aphids are rarely, again, only in very few circumstances do they cause real fatality. And what they are doing instead is going to be attracting a lot of your beneficial insects, the ones that are the natural predators. And so in the case of this situation, if you were desperate, you're like, oh, I can't possibly look at these yellow aphids, they drive me nuts. You could physically crush them along the stem. But keep in mind, these are the food for so many other life forms. And it's really better to just leave them, because why? Then you get stuff like this on the left. You get all of these ladybugs. So the ladybugs come to areas that are full of aphids. Then their larvae will eat aphids on the plant. Then they will find some place to hide and kind of form this pupa. And so these are ladybug pupae. Pupae sounds really weird, but that's actually, I think, the way you're supposed to say it. AE is an E sound. So pupae. So that's the plural of pupa. And so they're sitting here transforming into ladybugs, where they will repeat that whole cycle all over again. So if you sprayed with chemicals on that aphid infested milkweed, you might have killed a bunch of their larvae potentially. And then on the right here, the other thing you might do accidentally is you might actually be crushing the caterpillars of the monarch butterflies, because the monarch butterflies use milkweed as their host plant. So they will lay their eggs on the milkweed, the eggs will hatch, caterpillars will eat the milkweed throughout their life cycle, get fatter and fatter and fatter and fatter. But while they're small, you might not see them. You might be crushing a bunch of aphids and then just crushing either the eggs or the tiny caterpillars of the monarch butterflies, who are the purpose of why we plant milkweed in the first place. And so just generally speaking, be very cautious about what you're going to do as far as pest management on native milkweed and on plants in general, because you might be crushing, hurting, killing, spraying the beneficials as well. So it's usually a hands-off strategy is on 98% of the time the better bet. All right, so this one, this has leaves with different kinds of discolorations and blotches. Otherwise, the plant seemed relatively healthy. This person observed that there was scale on the underside of the leaves, so that's a particular insect issue. But then the spotting was something a little bit different. So this person was able to rule out a bunch of stuff. So they ruled out aphids and bacterial blight. They used a diagnosing tool to rule out Phytophthora ramorum. Phytophthora ramorum is sudden oak death. It's a particularly very, very dangerous and intense Phytophthora that is more prevalent in Northern California, and it has resulted in millions of oak trees all perishing up there. So it's a very scary thing if it were to come to Southern California. But our conditions, remember when we talked about that that disease triangle, the pathogen has to be present, the pathogen has to have favorable environmental conditions for it. And what was the third thing? Favorable environmental conditions, a favorable environment, the pathogen itself had to be present, and it had to have what? A host, right? Did anybody say that? Nobody said that. That's fine. It's cool. So a host. So you have to have all three of those things. So if your plant is a host and the pathogen is present, but the environment is not favorable, you won't get it. So the thing with Phytophthora ramorum, it really kind of requires slightly moister conditions, a little more ambient kind of moisture in the air, fog, drippy, kind of cooler coastal kind of environment. So think San Francisco, you know, that kind of an environment is a little bit more amenable to it than many places in Southern California. So the likelihood that it is Phytophthora ramorum is slim, not impossible, but slim. So this person was able to rule that out, luckily, as well. And then it was sooty mold and potentially anthracnose. I don't even know. I've never heard that one said, so forgive me if I mispronounce it, but anthracnose, because of its proximity to a sycamore, that's a possibility. So addressing cultural controls, selective pruning to remove affected parts, opening it up to more sunlight, right? Because we talked about sunlight and airflow being important for plants, spraying with a strong stream of water to remove some of the mold and the young crawlers to control the scale, and monitoring it and such. So this person kind of went through a lot of really good strategies for cultural control for this particular situation. All right, so next we have a sycamore tree, and the sycamore, among other species, is susceptible to the polyphagous shot-hole borer. And that's the very, very dangerous beetle that's kind of been coming through California and in Southern California. It's made already a very strong presence, and it attacks the trees. Remember I said it goes into the water carrying parts of the tree, right? So it's not just the dry bark, it goes into the living, you know, part of the tree. And it creates galleries, and it spits out fusarium onto the gallery walls and farms them. And then the tree dies, succumbs to the secondary fungal infection because of the fusarium. So are these holes that we're seeing shot hole borer? We don't know. So this is a possibility. I would say there's a strong likelihood that these holes are too large to be shot hole borer evidence. It's entirely possible. These are woodpecker holes. Woodpeckers make holes in trees all the time. And so that's a possibility. It's a possibility that it's another type of beetle. But if you were to analyze it to see if it's shot hole borer, you'd be looking for certain types of symptoms. So depending on the species, you can get gumming, right? So the sap comes out in gums. I don't think sycamores do that Sycamore will do this more like staining, right? So you'll see the staining on a sycamore. So if there's a lot of woody bark, you can scrape that bark off and try to get to the source of where that hole is and see if there's staining underneath the bark. And this, as an example, remember I said it's like a medium point ballpoint pen type size. You want to put that tip right up to the hole and see if they're identical in size. And if they are, then you're pretty guaranteed that it's a shot hole borer. If it's much bigger or much smaller, you're looking at a different kind of insect that may or may not be an issue to the tree. So this one requires a little bit more investigation, I would say. So what about this? So remember I said staining is not a good sign. So staining means something's going into the tree and it's trying to kind of weepy ooze and protect itself potentially either with sap or so this particular small, what it looks like coast live oak tree has staining on the trunk. So could that be the shot hole borer? Potentially, but likely not. And the reason why I say it's likely not is one, the shot hole borer tends to go after large mature trees, not younger saplings. So this is still quite a young tree, in my opinion. It doesn't have enough of the tree mass for it to make those galleries and really take advantage of the tree. So it's unlikely, not impossible, I would say, but unlikely that this is a shot hole borer. The other thing that tells me this is likely not the shot hole borer specifically is that the coast live oak tree doesn't usually get attacked at the trunk with shot hole borer, its limbs get attacked. So it is kind of referred to as almost immune. It's not really immune, but almost immune to the shot hole borer because its trunk is rarely ever attacked. It's only the limbs. And so you can usually cut the limbs off and the tree is fine, or the limbs will die back and seal themselves and then the tree is fine. So so this looks like potentially a different type of boring beetle or insect damage. So the weeping is not a good sign necessarily, but I would make sure to pay attention to the leaves and the other overall condition of the tree and other areas before jumping to any kind of major conclusions that any kind of intervention needs to be made. But if the tree itself looks like it's failing, the leaves are not thriving, it's not growing year after year, then you know something is weakening it, and then intervention will be needed for sure. But generally, yeah, weeping is not a great sign. All right, so sometimes we can look at something and there's a pest, sometimes there's a pathogen, sometimes there's something nutritional or water related that's causing some kind of an issue with the plant. So in the case of this citrus on the left, my first gut reaction might be that there's something nutritional going on, not that there's a particular disease. And so you're seeing the leaves turning chlorotic. Chlorotic means that they're it's when the leaves turn yellow, and that's a nutritional imbalance that's happening there. So on occasion, you will see the same kind of effects of an over-fertilized plant and one that's like starving for fertility. Same kind of appearance on an overwatered plant and an underwatered plant. So sometimes it can be a little bit tricky. And the same on this tree here, yellowing leaves on a species that is supposed to be evergreen. You know, could it be that we have not gotten rain for the last month and a half when really we should have? Maybe this is a water related thing. If the area is already still getting irrigated, however, then you can rule out water. If you're irrigating it a lot, and this is a drought tolerant species, then perhaps there's overwatering that's happening. So this is something I would say like cultural and nutritional related and not necessarily pathogenic. However, in order to rule things out, if you've gone through these diagnostic tools and you've been able to rule things out and make some changes, or you feel really confident, then great. if you've gone through all the diagnostic tools from the UCIPM website and you've done your research and you've done your kind of experimentation and you're still confused or you're still unsure of what is happening to your plant, when all else fails, LA County Agriculture Commissioners for weights and measures, they have a pathology laboratory, both an entomology and as well as a plant disease diagnosis laboratory, where you can get a sheet that looks just like this. You can download it. If you go to this website, you just click on your insect vertebrate specimen form or your plant disease diagnostic mushroom form. You see the form, you fill out that form, you get your sample of your plant, put it in the baggie. You're going to explain what is going on with your plant. It's turning yellow. I've tried this, da, 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 or, you know, black spots on it. Don't know what's wrong with it. Or this is a bug I found in the bark of my tree. And these are other things that I'm seeing about the tree. I don't know what it is. You put these things in a baggie and you send it to the laboratory, and their lab, I believe, is in Southgate, so it's not too far. I actually, when I use their services, I drive it over there and deliver it myself, just because I don't want to miss a window of time in case the mail service is slow. But this is something that you can do. This is a free service. It's meant so that people can protect LA from pathogens and pests. So this is an entirely free service. Just don't expect an overnight response. It will take weeks, potentially a couple months, up to a couple months, depending on how busy they are and how much of a priority it is. If they have some job somewhere where they have a ton of it's a really high risk situation, they're going to prioritize that most likely over somebody's garden plant, you know. And so, but this is a resource to you. So if this, I wonder if I can, no. I will, if some people are interested, I'll look up the exact thing, put it in the chat so that you guys can save it. If you can't, just write it down from here, because obviously that's a very long URL. All right, move quickly in the chat. Yes, Jack's saying they're super helpful. Winter yellow, yeah, winter yellowing can be a thing. So somebody asked what to do with native milkweed in the winter. So native milkweed dies back in the winter. Naturally, it just dies. So it turns into nothing. You can leave it looking ugly and brown. Birds sometimes will use the stems for nesting. Otherwise, you can just cut it down. If you have milkweed that's evergreen, then that is not native milkweed. So if it's staying alive all winter, then you likely have the tropical variety, in which case I also recommend that you cut it all down in the winter time. So that, number one, the new growth comes up without any potential disease affecting it, which is something that happens with milkweed and that harms butterflies, but also so that you discourage the butterflies from mating and reproducing during the winter. So they shouldn't be doing that at that time, and we should be encouraging them to be migrating. All right. Somebody asked, just because I think the photo was there in the front page, how tough is redbud? The redbud is very, very tough. It doesn't get very large, but one thing I will say is it likes to have seasons. So it likes to be very cold when it's cold, like in the winter, very warm when it's warm. It wants those obvious changes in season. So if you're going to plant it on the coast, really, really coastal, where it's like, yeah, it maybe gets up to 85 degrees and then maybe goes down to like 65 degrees. And then, you know, like it has just like that, not as much variation between the seasons. It's not going to be as happy, or it's not going to bloom as well. It's not going to go dormant as obviously in the winter and then bloom all at the same time in the late winter, early spring. So I would just say, you know, don't put it somewhere where it doesn't get cold enough in the winter. All right. Okay. Now we're going to stop this share and get back to the content. Here we were. Okay, so we did this. All right, so now we're going to talk about pruning. So obviously, in an ideal world, all of these classes would be done in person, every single one of them, because there's stuff to show in person and in a tactile way and in a way where you guys get to practice this that we can't do over Zoom. However, I'm going to do my best to be as animated as possible so that we can understand the content for the pruning. And keep in mind, there's still one more in-person optional workshop at Tree People's headquarters, and we get to talk all about pruning. So that's something where you might have the opportunity to see some things in person in that case. So we want to identify the reasons to prune, appropriate techniques, how to prune based on the season, and also tool hygiene, which is also very important because it also connects to the pathogen conversation we just had. So we'll jump right into it. Okay, so reasons to prune. So rejuvenation, right? So rejuvenation is about bringing new life and encouraging robust growth in the plants. So sometimes when the plant gets a little bit like sad or tired, sometimes a hard pruning can reinvigorate the plant. Aesthetics, so this is about shaping, having desired look in the garden. Plant health, diseased, damaged, dead wood, dead material is not necessarily healthy to have around the landscape or have hanging onto the plant. There's some exception to that in the sense that some dead material is nesting material for birds or will become useful for certain types of insects, not the bad insects necessarily, but we want to make sure that we have kind of habitat for all sorts of kinds of wildlife. And so sometimes leaving dead wood is something beneficial to wildlife. However, in most cultivated gardens, the removal of dead wood is preferential. So keeping branches and debris out of pathways and other kinds of garden spaces. So obviously it's literally just about being able to move through your yard with ease. And so that's sometimes how, you know, pruning can be looked at, is just for just the ease of being able to move around. So this, we already identified it. This is a Western redbud, everybody. So this is that tree we were just talking about. The leaves are just emerging. So the cool thing about this guy is that it goes dormant in the winter. All the leaves fall off. It's only branches. And then the first thing it does is it flowers. So manzanitas do this, ceanothus does this, and the redbud does this. The first thing they do when they get some rain and it starts to like kind of warm up a little bit is they start flowering. So these are winter or early spring bloomers. And then it pushes leaves. So again, manzanitas do the exact same thing. Flowers first, then pushes leaves. Ceanothus does that. Flowers first, then pushes leaves. All right, so ways to prune. We're talking about actual techniques of pruning. So deadheading. So deadheading is the actual removal of individual spent flowers or flower clusters. You can do that before the seeds mature. Because if you do it before the seeds mature, sometimes it can prolong the flowering season of certain species, might even encourage some new growth. But if you want the seeds to mature, you can leave them on. In the case of this here, this is Eriogonum blisianum. This is a hybrid buckwheat. It's a hybrid between the St. Catherine's lace buckwheat and the Santa Cruz Island buckwheat. So this one has got these flower clusters that all dried up, and then they're ready to be removed. So you're seeing on the left, the old flower clusters, and on the right, obviously all of that removed. And it makes it just look, you know, obviously much more tidy. So same here, removal of spent flower clusters. This is a whirly blue Cleveland sage. So removing all the spent flower clusters leaves a tidier looking plant on the right. But this is all very good bird food. So that's another little comment on the bottom. all the seed heads of the sage are big attractors for various bird species. So they'll come to the seed heads, eat out of those little kind of seed pods, and then, you know, take off. And so you want to give that opportunity for the birds to get their fill before you do your pruning. So sometimes it's good to leave it all summer and let the birds do their thing. The other alternative is that you prune them and you identify a location where you can leave them on the ground and let animals come and pick at it afterwards. That's not a good thing if you're in a fire territory, or if you're putting it up against your house. You want to locate some, like a little brush pile like that, or clippings pile or pruning pile, farther away from any kind of structure if you're going to do that. All right. So more on deadheading. So this one's an Encilia farinosa. So again, get your clients' preferences as far as habitat value versus aesthetics. Sometimes the blooms, the next year's blooms will be better if you've kind of removed all of the previous year's blooms, or at least aesthetically, it seems like the blooms are better because they don't have all these little dead, dead seed flower heads nearby. But keep in mind, you want to get the preferences of your client in as part of your strategy. So if your client is like, I'm huge on birds, I don't care what it looks like, I just want to support habitat, you might choose to leave these things on for a really, really long time until there's not a single seed left on it, then remove it. Whereas if you have a client that says, I hate things that look dead, I want it to look clean and tidy all the time, then you might find yourself doing sooner pruning than before the seeds are all gone. Or you might take the seeds off if they're mature. You might physically take the seeds off and scatter them, and then just take the plant down. All right, so mowing. So mowing is the use of a lawnmower. It could be like a string trimmer, one of those weed whackers or something like that. The idea is that you're cutting something down to the ground for the most part. Cutting down plants, mostly grasses, but could also be done to epilobium. Those are our fuchsias and achillea in late season. So you can actually mow these things. You can also just coppice them. We'll talk about coppicing. That's kind of a similar outcome, but obviously you're not using a mower. So it creates a manicured appearance, make a lawn more usable, so it's a little bit less moundy. But some of our native lawn substitutes are moundy, and so it's kind of takes away from their natural appearance to try to create something super manicured. But this is a good example of the epilobium. This is the fuchsia. So fuchsias with the red tubular flowers. In a previous class, it was a beautiful bank of fuchsias, and it said native plants can be weedy too. And we talked about how epilobium or the fuchsias spread by rhizomes. And I said, I would love to have a plant that's really, really happy like that. And I wouldn't categorize that as weedy in a negative sense. So this is that plant hacked back. So now this plant has been completely cut back to the ground. And you will do this every winter. So this particular species needs to be done kind of like at the I think of it as like a New Year's hacking back. And you actually have to do this every year for it to grow really fuller and in a more kind of green, full manner rather than stringy with a lot of dead matter inside. So this is kind of like a requirement after the plant is a little more established. You're not going to do it, with a 2-month-old plant. You're going to wait a whole year before you do that. But that's something that's required. And it encourages more spreading. It encourages more of that rhizome activity because you've cut all the stuff on top that it was sending a bunch of energy into. And now it has all this energy in the ground to do what it wants to do, to keep growing. So it's going to grow underground and then shoot up more. So it actually really invigorates the plant, and it has it looking really, really good that following season when you do this. So grasses, you can mow them regularly if they're a lawn substitute, but if they're a seasonal, if they're a bunch grass, a perennial bunch grass, meaning it kind of has this point of origin where it kind of forms this tuft or clump, then those you would, coppice. So we would cut those down in their off season. So cool season grasses would get cut in the fall, warm season grasses get cut in the late winter or spring. So you want to cut them before their season for growing. So cool season grasses need cool temperatures and moisture to be active. So at the late fall, it's been hot, they're dormant, they're not happy, they're waiting for cooler, season. So, and just as that's about to happen, if you cut them back, all the new growth comes in without any of that brown, dormant growth in their way. They just get to come out really nice and fresh. Same thing with the warm season grasses. So warm season grasses in the winter or early spring haven't come out of their winter dormancy yet. So once it starts warming up, they're going to start emerging. So you cut all of that growth off, all of their old winter dormant growth off. And so all the new stuff comes up, and it comes up just green with no other brown around it. All right, so edging. Edging is something most people are familiar with when it comes to lawns. So you use that edge trimmer around a parkway and you get these perfect little clean lines. Well, we're not talking about edging in that way. We're talking more about just maybe a ground cover shrub that's about to creep over into a walkway, and how do we edge that to keep a tidier appearance. And so it's about keeping stuff off of streets. It's about keeping stuff off of walkways. It is something you would do in the case of a parkway planting. If this was a parkway, and then say this driveway that you're seeing to the right of it was actually a sidewalk, you'd want to make sure that there was a nice clean edge. One thing that's tricky about edging a shrub, even if it's a ground cover shrub, is if you just edge in a straight line, if you just took hedge trimmers and you just trim it like this, everywhere where you trimmed, they would be shooting a bunch of new growth every year, and then you would do it again and it would just keep bulging, and then eventually all you would see is brown under here and a bulging new growth on top. So you'd actually end up with this high point next to the walkway that would be really unsightly. So the way to do edging so that you disguise that and you actually have it draping closer or coming lower as it approaches the walkway is actually to alternate where you make your cuts. It's not to cut in a straight line. It's to cut here and then 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 here. I hope you're seeing my cursor and not just hearing me say that. And so you want to make sure that you're going farther into the shrub and cutting farther back than you expect in multiple places, and alternating it so that they're growing back in different ways and at different points, so that two plants that are sending a bunch of new growth are not side by side making themselves bulge, but like this guy can grow here and this guy can grow here, and it can rest next to each other in a way that still maintains that smooth appearance rather than weird, bulky, bulgy appearance. So I hope that made a little bit of sense. But so edging should be treated that way, not in a straight line. Vary where you make your cuts and put some of those cuts farther back into the shrub than you expect, knowing that they're going to start creeping out, and you want to make sure that they're creeping out in a kind of a smooth downward manner. All right. Here's another example. This is Ceanothus Yankee Point at an entry garden. Very, very formal. So this is a very formal style garden, if you couldn't tell already. So there are going to be some native plants that really work for that formal garden, and some that look a little bit better with a more naturalistic garden style. And so that's the beauty about native plants, is it has such a palette that you can work with. So in this case, this is obviously a formal garden. All right, so thinning or lifting is the removal of entire stems either to create an architectural look, right, to expose some of the structure, or to just open up structure for plant health, right, to get more air circulation, to create a desired shape that you're looking for. Sometimes it's just to remove dead material, removing crossed branches, right, so you have too many branches crossing, you might remove one, so it kind of just looks better, but it's also structurally. Somebody asked in the chat, using an electronic shear for edging. I would do it by hand personally. It's a little bit tedious, but you risk, again, doing it in a straight line if you use something that's really fast, unless you're speaking of a tool that I'm not familiar with. Okay, so removing an entire branch. So this is a good, just how to prune a plant correctly, or how to prune a branch. Could be on a shrub or a tree. So we're going to talk about two types of cuts. So one is just a plain old cut that you can do. If it's a narrow, remember, you're going to use the right tool for the right job. If it's a small branch and you can use just a handheld pruner, then you're going to make a single cut, and you're going to do it outside the branch collar. So you're not going to do it straight up and down. You're not going to cut it here where you're going to expose the inner part of this tree or shrub or branch. You're going to do it just outside the branch collar, because you want it to be able to close this wound. So just outside the branch collar, you're going to make a single cut. If you have a really big, thick branch, heavy branch, this could be off of a tree or a large shrub, you're going to do something called a 3-cut approach. And the 3-cut approach, you're going to use a saw. This is a context where you would use a saw. You're going to make your first cut. Your first cut is not going to be where you want your final cut. So think about where you want your final cut, where you want the aesthetics of the plant, right? It's going to be like outside the branch collar. You're going to go farther out than that. You're going to make a notch on the underside of the branch. You're just going to go like a third of the way up, or potentially even less. But say like a third of the way up, you're going to make a notch. You're going to cut from underneath. Your second cut is going to be just past that, and you're going to try to do the full cut. Why do we do this? The reason why we make a notch, do you guys know when the in the cartoons they would show somebody cutting a tree, and before they finish cutting, they've only gone part way, the tree starts going timber and falls, because the weight of the tree is so much that they only have to do a partial cut to get it to fall, and then it makes a big crack sound, and it falls on the ground, and it's like, yay, we felled a tree. So in the context of a heavy branch, when you start cutting from the top, it will be so heavy that it will start to split, and it will start going timber before you finish that cut. And if you haven't finished that cut, what that falling branch is going to do is it's going to take all the bark and shred a whole wound out of that plant or that tree or that shrub. So it's going to take the bark with it, and it's going to create this big gaping open wound and just shred it down, potentially down the whole trunk, or definitely down the branch, but possibly down the trunk. And so that open wound becomes now this opening for disease to come in. It's harder for that tree to heal from something like that, and so you end up with harming the plant or tree. And so this notch, by having this cut at the underside, just when it starts going timber and starts falling, that notch stops that shredding process. So it starts to shred, and then it goes boop, and it just cuts right off. Then you're left with this random little knob that's really lightweight, that doesn't have all this heavy branch weight on the end anymore. It's just this lightweight knob, like a little hat rack. And then you do your final cut, and you're able to go through all the way without it doing that thing where its weight, gravity starts pulling it down. So then you're able to do a nice clean cut. The tree is able to seal its own wound really easily, and that's that. So those are two kinds of approaches to cutting. One is if it's small enough that you can just do a single cut, great. If it's big and you need a saw, you do the 3-cut approach. First the notch, then the second cut past the notch, then your final cut where you want it. All right. Yes, and so somebody asked, so it doesn't peel? Yes, so it's peeling. When it starts falling, it will peel all of that bark and tissue from your tree. Okay, so that's the strategy for trees and also large shrubs. If it's a smaller shrub, you don't need to worry about it. Even if you use a saw and it's a tiny shrub, some people like to use a small saw in lieu of pruners. You don't need to do a 3-cut approach. It's only when that's a thick branch and there's a lot of weight to it. All right, so removing stems. This is kind of just an example of cleanup, in my opinion. So this dead branch in the middle obviously is extremely unsightly. So you can remove that and tidy up the ends, and it kind of looks a little bit more well-rounded also. So there seems to be some selective pruning as far as removing kind of dead material. It's also good for removing dead material for fire safety. The other thing you see for fire safety is the lifting of plants. And so this one in particular, the thinning of the upright branches of Melasma laurina, that is the laurel sumac, which is the most prevalent shrub on our hillsides in Southern California. It's a phenomenally resilient species that is one of the last standing ones after repeated fires have decimated the landscape. This one seems to be okay coming back each time. So it's one of the more resilient of our shrubs. But this one, we wanted to plant a yucca nearby. And so to make space for that, they pruned the lower branches and kind of created this opening so that the yucca could be planted. The other thing that sometimes is done is lower branches are removed and it's just left almost like a tree on top. So just the foliage is on top. That's for lifting for fire clearance. That's something that's frequently done. And to those of you in the chat, my apologies for anyone who's getting bumped off because of the winds. The winds have been crazy today. So I hear you. Do your best to make it back on. If you have connection issues, that's 100% out of your control. So thank you for letting me know. And good luck. Okay. Thinning of sambucus. So sambucus is the elderberry. So elderberries grow with lots and lots of trunks and stems and branches. They tend to be very, very multi-branching. And so there's a pathway here that is blocked by the branches. And so we lifted and thinned some of the material so that there's a better pathway through. So that's another example. So tip pinching. So tip pinching is a strategy whereby you take usually a young plant and you pinch off the tip right above a set of leaves or the leaf nodes. And so you can do this just when the new growth is coming in. And what it encourages is a fuller appearance. And so this is commonly done on sages. So the image you're seeing here is a Cleveland sage. For sages, especially Cleveland sage in particular, they have a tendency to grow really big and tall and then get really weighty and then split down the middle. And so you often end up with this incredible plant that puts on this wonderful flower show, and then it just goes like, and then it just, you can see this like fissure down the center. And so if you have a young Cleveland sage, for instance, when it's growing, I would say late winter, spring, tip pinching the ends of each of the branches will encourage a bunch of growth to happen at each of these leaf nodes, which will then make it rounder, which will make it more stable and more symmetrical and kind of have somehow a more stable base. And so it'd be much less likely to just kind of split open. When it's got 3 branches or maybe 6 branches and they're really tall and weighty, that's when they split open. But if it has 20 branches and they're all a little bit shorter, it's much less likely to do that. So tip pinching is a strategy to avoid that. Okay, so reduction or heading back. So the idea of this is usually about making something smaller or shorter or redirecting the growth. And so it's cutting a terminal or leading branch back to a lateral branch that is typically 1/3 of the size of the branch or more. So you want to make sure that the branches that you're cutting it back to have enough energy to kind of take over that space that big one was taking over, I guess. So for example, this little, it's not very noticeable, but this is actually a central leading branch right here. It's kind of coming up to a point here, and it's taking all this energy, directing it here, and the plant itself is pretty unbalanced. So you can see that the plant is leaning in one direction. And so what they did was they cut it back and is encouraging more energy to go into the lateral branches, which will hopefully round out the shrub over time. So for instance, this is the branch they cut. These are the branches that are going to now get all that energy, right? And it's going to make it probably a rounder plant, a little less energy going vertically. And you can see that these are about 1/3 of the diameter of the main stem. You don't do this on trees. So, right, we call that like topping a tree. You don't do this on a tree. Trees it is advisable to have a central leading stem on a tree. But this is for shrubs, right? So we want a rounded shrub. So coppicing is fun. Coppicing means you're cutting back a plant all the way down to the ground or within 6 inches of the ground. So it invigorates older plants. It produces a lot of upright shoots. It mimics the effect of like a fire coming in and taking the plant down to nothing and then rejuvenating it. If you do that too often, the plant doesn't have enough energy to do that, to rejuvenate. But if the plant is old and it hasn't been rejuvenated in a long time, doing that really helps. And so some plants that can be coppiced, one plant in particular that's really good at it is Baccharis, which is the coyote brush. Every 5 to 10 years, you can cut that down to the ground and it just starts all over again as though you just planted it. Some buckwheats are okay being coppiced, not all of them. The Western redbud, believe it or not, has a better flower show when it has lots and lots of branches. When it's pruned like a little standard lollipop tree, it's actually less happy. It's not a natural form for it. It wants to be multi-branching. And so conceivably, if you had it in your yard and say it was pretty tired and it wasn't blooming really well, you could cut that down to the ground and it'll shoot up a bunch of new stems and trunks and then become like a bush for a while and then a multi-trunk tree eventually. The Matillaha poppy, which is that fried egg flower, that one appreciates a yearly coppicing just like the fuchsia, around the same time a year too. So you cut that down, maybe a little earlier than that, but you cut that down to the ground annually. Salvias you can do it with, hit or miss. Sometimes they come back, sometimes they don't. Manzanitas also hit or miss. Sometimes they come back, sometimes they don't. So there are some manzanitas that are crown sprouters, right? They sprout after fire, they regrow after fire, and some that are not. So I wouldn't do this as a regular thing, or potentially ever with a manzanita, unless you know 100% that this is a crown sprouting species and something about the state or status of that particular plant requires rejuvenation. I think it would be very unlikely that you would need to do that as a requirement. Somebody asked to go back to the heading back. I remember some of these notes, some of this content will be in your student handbook. So some of this information is in there. All right. I'm going to move forward. Sorry, can't stay too long. We got a lot of stuff to cover. All right, wait, so we did coppicing. Oh yeah, coppicing, cutting down to the ground, rejuvenates plants. Shearing, right? So shearing is like trying to create this formal hedge look, for instance, a visual or physical barrier. They should be wider at the bottom than they are at the top. The idea if they were completely the same, when the sun hits it, it would shade the entire bottom. So if they're a little bit wider at the bottom, then the sun can really kind of touch all of the leaves and you get a healthier plant out of it. You want your sharp shears and you want to avoid creating dead spaces in the middle. If they're sheared too densely, you end up with that effect where the whole middle part is dead. It's basically the hundreds of reduction cuts across the entire canopy of the plant, basically, is what it does. And the way that it responds is the way that a plant would respond to a reduction cut, which is that you cut the energy from going in this direction. Now it's redirecting it at all of these points. So all these leaf nodes are now going to produce leaves, and you're going to get a really dense, bushy plant as a result. Here's an example of a lemonade berry hedge at Santa Barbara Botanic Garden. This is 75 years old, so they were able to do this for years and years and years and years without it looking dead, which is great. And this is a cool little experimental thing at LA Byproducts. LA Byproducts is a former landfill that's in near Sun Valley. It's actually pretty close to Theodore Payne. And so they have been landscaping their site with native plants for many years, and they do very little care and maintenance after the plants are established. So this is Dana Point buckwheat, which grew in these little perfect mounds, and they just took kind of a hedge trimmer and just sheared the sides so that they can get their vehicles in and out. And they look like they're from, like, I don't know, Mario Brothers or some cute little, like, I want to pet them, or like they're little animals, like little hedgehogs. I don't know, they're really, really cute. But this is something that you could conceivably play with, is shearing plants and seeing what they do. But this one in particular has a very tight form, so it responds favorably. So espaliers. Espalier sounds really hoity-toity, and what espalier is training a plant along a wall or a fence. And so you can take that to a pretty extreme point that I don't care for myself, which is to train even like fruit trees. You can look it up. If you Google espalier, you'll see some real like forms where they've even trained fruit trees along like this geometric pattern to be completely vertical or, you know, flat against a wall or a fence. And it's not my favorite thing, but to espalier certain shrubs in a more natural sense that are really amenable to being espaliered is actually very beautiful. So in particular, this one is the Vermontodendron. And this one has these really kind of like arching branches. And so it's quite easy to just train those arching branches to stay along the wall and to remove branches that don't want to go in that direction. And so this is an attempt to put a plant in a narrower space. And so plants that don't mind the pruning, plants that have arching branches do really well in that scenario. So California lilacs work, Western redbud, manzanita. I've even seen, you know, like the native honeysuckle does well like that. What else? Ribes. So you can do the currants and gooseberries. You can espalier. So that's a technique. Seasons to prune. So pruning is seasonal depending on the plant type and the growing season. So ground covers, it obviously depends on species, but generally after flowering and prior to vegetative growth. That's misspelled, apologies, I did not correct that. Vegetative growth, edging can be anytime you need to clean up the pathways, but also keep in mind things like nesting season and wildlife benefit. If you're cutting off active flowers, those are things that will affect your timing as well. So I said nesting, even though we're talking about ground covers, but keep in mind that nesting occurs in not only in trees. That's something that's just commonly understood, that birds nest in trees, but birds also nest in bushes, and birds also nest on the ground. So they could nest on the ground inside a ground cover shrub. So if you're doing it in the middle of spring or early summer, then you could conceivably be disrupting that. Just keep that in mind and be careful and cautious. Conifers, right? So we have pine trees, junipers, incense cedars, etc. You can prune any time of the year. Again, keep in mind nesting season though. So for the tree, it might not matter that much, but if there are birds nesting in there, it does matter. So you want to make sure that you're pruning at the time of year where there's less wildlife activity. For semi-evergreen species, we call semi-evergreen those plants that go somewhat dormant, maybe in the summertime, or they have some time of year when they're not quite as active. And so you want to prune those generally in their off season. So late summer, early fall is a good rule of thumb for many of the species, like the monkey flowers, sagebrush, you know, what is it, Kenyan sunflower, these examples, sages. So late summer, early fall, generally good rule of thumb. Evergreens and herbaceous perennials and shrubs, after flowering is fine because you're going to be cleaning up maybe dead flowers, and that might occur throughout the summer. But be, again, careful about nesting, be careful about wildlife value and removing that wildlife value. You want to be pruning. I generally do quite a lot. Most of my pruning is late summer, early fall. Some of the pruning is like mid winter, right, kind of at the New Year's or just after New Year's. So those are my main times of year. The one difference will be with manzanitas and ceanothus. There's a little bit of a different timing window for that, and I'll share a little bit more in a minute. So here's an example of a salvia on the left. This is a type of Cleveland sage that was pruned in the fall versus not pruned at all. So this one actually was headed back entirely. So it was almost coppiced, I would say, in November, December, and it solidly regrew and kind of rejuvenated. And this one was untouched, but it's still fine. It's just like really big and a little bit more scraggly. So you have two kind of extremes. You could do a partial of, you know, you could do where you've deadheaded these flowers and then maybe just take off like a third of the plant, and then it will still be really big. Wouldn't be necessarily as small as this, but you'd still get some of that rejuvenation. And Robert in the chat says a nesting survey is always recommended before any tree trimming at the reservation. Yes, 100%. Nesting surveys should be part of every single bit of tree work. And unfortunately, in other areas, like sometimes on this with street trees or you know, just general contractors that come and do work in neighborhoods, they don't quite use that same level of conscientiousness. All right, so flowering perennials, after the first flush of flowers, you can do your pruning, but I let plants go to seed, so make sure you're kind of letting things go to seed before you start cutting them off. Again, it's more of like cleaning up dead material. So you don't want to make excessive heading cuts. You don't want, like this, for instance, is a Ceanothus Joyce coulter that's been repeatedly kind of, I guess, sheared almost, or made into almost a odd hedge. You don't want to repeatedly prune for size control to the point that the plant cannot show its purpose. Plants that want to be 8 feet wide shouldn't be pruned repeatedly so that they stay 3 feet wide. So it's better to remove that plant and plant an appropriate species instead of repeatedly hacking back at that plant. It's not fair for it, because it wants to bloom, it wants to grow, it wants to do all that, and then you also end up with just an ugly plant generally. You don't want to prune right before flowering. This will result in the loss of flowers. That seems pretty obvious that, you know, if you're going to prune a plant and cut off the flower buds, that should be obvious, but there are a couple species where that's not very obvious on our native plants. So the ceanothus and the manzanitas, remember I said how it blooms first thing in the winter. It rains and then that triggers their blooming. So it blooms in the winter, maybe early spring, then it puts out leaves. So if you prune in the fall, or wait, let me explain the whole life cycle. Then it puts out leaves. So it puts out leaves all spring, and then the leaf growth kind of stops as it gets really hot in the summer. And when it stops, they set their buds for next year's flowers on the ends of those leaves. So the ceanothus has buds for their future flowers on the ends of those branches that they just grew. And so does manzanita. They have little nascent flower buds on the ends of the leaf, the growth. And so if you at the late summer, you're doing all your late summer, fall pruning, you decide you're going to prune your manzanita and you're going to prune your ceanothus, you're going to end up cutting off the following year's flowers. So the time to do your pruning for the ceanothus and the manzanita is actually best done in early spring, after it flowers, but before it finishes growing leaves, but on a warm, dry day. So don't do it when it's wet, and because you can get all sorts of fungal diseases and stuff. Don't do it on a misty day. Don't do it on a wet day or foggy day, anything like that. Wait for a clear, dry day, then you do it. Just sometime in the spring before it finishes growing for the year. All right. Don't do this. Don't make a weird cylinder out of a sage. And that's another potential example of, you know, a plant that was planted too close to the pathway. And so, but it was still pruned in a very weird way. All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a break. It's 7:09. We're going to take, let's do a 10-minute break. So we'll come back at 7:19. And while you're on your break, think about this based on the things that we talked about. What are two plant species which are happiest when coppiced annually, right? Coppice means cut down to the ground every year. What are two species that I've mentioned that are happiest when coppiced to the ground annually every year, and two species that would probably die if you coppice them annually? So think about that while you're on your break, and then when you come back from your break, you can pop your answers into the chat and we can discuss it before moving on to the next part of our class. All right, it is 7:19. I'm going to start looking in the chat. See if people have responded. Ooh, nice. All right. All right, so we have Manzanita will hate you if you coppice it down to the ground. It would be your first and last coppicing unless you have a resprouting, one of those crown sprouting manzanitas. But even then, they would not want it to happen annually. So I would say that is a very correct answer. Remember, that's a strategy that certain species have adapted to coming back after fire, but they have to have the energy reserves underground to be able to rejuvenate that way. And if you do it every single year and you make them do it all the time, deplete them to nothing and then have to have them start over, they'll just run out of energy reserves and they can't necessarily do it. So that's even if, you know, that's a species that can do it. Somebody says Ceanothus doesn't like to be cut much in my experience. And I would say, yes, that's probably also a species that you would not want to coppice, probably ever. You'd probably never want to coppice it, but definitely not on an annual basis. All right. So somebody's saying salvia can get coppiced annually. I wouldn't do annually on the salvia. It's once it gets woody, it sometimes has a hard time rejuvenating from that. But the recommendation is every 5 to 10 years on the coyote brush. So that's correct. You wouldn't want to coppice a coyote brush every single year. Same with the Western redbud. That's a once in a many years kind of a event. You don't do it annually. But one that can go annually is the California fuchsia. So yes, that is correct. California fuchsia wants to be coppiced every single year. So Barron says coppice epilobium and salvia, do not coppice Ceanothus or Arctostaphylos. So yes, on both the Ceanothus and Arctostaphylos, yes on the epilobium. I will say iffy on the salvia, depends on the species and depends on the age of the plant. Sometimes yes, it's fine, but not on an annual basis, I would say. Yes, epilobium will look terrible if you don't annually coppice it. The common name for Ceanothus, Mary, is California lilac. Oh, Charles already answered you. California lilac. So epilobium and Elymus. Elymus is a type of grass species. So yes, you can coppice that every year, but probably not a quercus, which is an oak, or Arctostaphylos, which is the manzanita. Don't want to do that on an annual basis for sure. Buckwheat and California poppy. So California poppy you can conceivably coppice, but it's usually an annual, not a perennial, though it can be perennial sometimes. So it can develop that kind of carrot-like taproot that rejuvenates. So you can sometimes coppice it and have it rejuvenate. Buckwheat, it depends on the kind of buckwheat, but generally speaking, I wouldn't coppice buckwheats on an annual basis, only certain buckwheat species periodically. Alexa says milkweed and Matilaha poppies do well with coppicing, and that is correct. I will say milkweed you can coppice during their dormant season, and Matilaha poppies also in the fall, winter do really well if you coppice them down to the ground. It encourages more of that rhizome activity where it spreads from underground and they kind of grow in a thicker manner. Coppicing is okay for fuchsia and coyote brush. Yes, fuchsia annually, coyote brush every 5 to 10 years. Not good, no bueno on manzanita and some Ceanothus, and I will say that's correct. Charles says coppicing kills Abutylon palmeri in his experience. So Abutylon palmeri is the Indian mallow. They have kind of, I don't know if it's not quite heart-shaped leaves, but larger, fuzzy, velvety leaves with yellow mallow flowers. And that one, I have also observed that they are not amenable to being coppiced. The native milkweed, Mary, you don't have to leave it up if it's dormant and died back completely. And for the wintertime, all of the energy is underground. And if it's just dead stems on top, you can cut that off. And you can throw it in the garbage, you can distribute it, you can leave it for nesting, etc. All right. So Matilda, Poppy, and Epilobium, not Manzanitas and Ceanothus. The question is, how would Gambelia respond? That's a very good question. I think Gambelia would tolerate occasional coppicing. I wouldn't do annual coppicing on a Gambelia, but I think it would actually tolerate some periodic cutting back hard. Coyote brush and wisdom. Buckwheat would benefit. Again, it depends on the buckwheat. Our Eriogonum fasciculatum tends to kind of regrow, but if you coppiced the St. Catherine's lace buckwheat, the Eriogonum giganteum, just cut it down to the ground, it's probably going to be just a goner. Oh, Jack says Western ragweed, Ambrosia silostachya, and Stipa pulchra, which is our state grass, which is purple needlegrass. They can be happily coppiced annually, and yes, that is absolutely true. Woolly blue curls and hollyleaf redberry would hate it. And that's a very, yes, that is correct. So that woody shrub, the hollyleaf redberry, Rhamnus ilicifolia, would probably, it's possible it would come back, like if in the sense of once every 20 years or 50 years or 100 years, if there was a fire, it might rejuvenate. But in the context of daily coppicing, it would just die back completely. Mission manzanita. I don't, it's possible it would come back from a one-time coppicing, but I wouldn't count on it. I for sure wouldn't count on it. I wouldn't encourage that for a daily, yearly thing. And that's unfortunate that your neighbor cut down one. I'd give it some time. It depends on how long ago they cut it. You want to give it some time to see if it will rejuvenate, but if it hasn't, and you haven't seen any evidence of it coming back after, you know, months, then likelihood is that it didn't survive that. So an annual coppice tolerant, mimulus. Intolerant would be coast live oak. So coast live oak could tolerate like one coppicing, you know, like once, and maybe a fire came and it came through, but definitely not annually. Mimulus, it depends on the species. So if you're doing the mimulus, meaning just the general monkey flowers, I found that they can do a harder pruning-ish, but not, I wouldn't coppice those down to the ground. But the water-loving monkey flowers, they're not mimulus, they're now erythranthe. Those I think can be coppiced. We have, I'm seeing Wicca, but I think that meant yucca. And I don't know what ice, but yucca, yeah, you wouldn't want to coppice a yucca. I think you'd potentially lose it. And Celias can take some hard pruning, that's true, but not down to nothing, like not down to the ground, but it can take a very hard prune. Rogers Red doesn't mind being coppiced. Yeah, the vines, grapevines could probably be coppiced annually if you were desperate to keep them very small. But the point of the grapevine is obviously for it to be able to trail and ramble over structures and such. So it would be very unlikely that you would do that. I would say there are certain things that, like, hey, maybe they'll tolerate it. There are other things that, like, they actually like it. So Matilda poppy, I think, likes it. Fuchsias, I think, like it. Grasses, perennial grasses and such, I think, like it. And then other things, maybe they tolerate it, or maybe they can do it occasionally. Doug Talamy says it's okay to coppice an oak if you want a shrub. Yes, you could conceivably coppice it once to encourage it to just bush out like a big bush, and then prune it the way you want to. There are people who can even make hedges out of coast live oak trees. I wouldn't take a big tree and make it small. I would just start with something small and just continually prune it the way you want it instead. Yes, so coppicing and hard pruning can mimic herbivory. Willows can be coppiced, absolutely. It'll encourage them to bush out more, and some of them spread by rhizomes also, and so you'll get more of that activity. And all right. Cool, great, very good. I think that was excellent. Excellent answers. So we're going to go over some of the tools. All right. So keeping your tools sharp is important so that you're not damaging plants. So if your tools aren't sharp, you're more just like grabbing and crushing the tissues instead of like slicing cleanly through them. So you want to make sure that you have clean, sharp tools. And so you can actually get tool sharpening kits at Theodore Payne. They sell them. You can also find them in your own, wherever you do your shopping, whether online or not. And so you can keep the blades of your tools nice and sharp. You want to use the tool safely, know the tool, know how to use the tool, and make sure you're using all types of safety precautions. So if you're using a chainsaw, that's going to be different than if you're using a hand pruner. As far as, you know, the kinds of clothes you wear and the kinds of protective gear you have. So just make sure that you're performing the work safely. Hand tools are obviously slower than power tools. However, they allow for much more precise cuts, and you're a little bit more aware of every single cut that you're making. And so that also protects you as far as protecting your hearing, and potentially, depending on whether it's gas powered or not, it could be protective to the environment and protective to the just ambient. You know, you can reduce noise pollution when you use hand tools as well. All right, so hygiene is very, very important. So this is where I said that this lesson kind of ties into the plants and pathogen section of the of our kind of module. And so hygiene is really, really important. When it comes to tools, in a similar way that if you were to cut raw chicken and then cut lettuce for a salad, you would end up eating salmonella and getting sick from the salad. Not because the salad touched the meat, but it touched the same tool that touched the meat. So in garden care, in landscape care, in nurseries, etc., there's all these opportunities for pathogens to transfer among the landscape or among the plants. And one of the ways that we can make sure that that doesn't happen is by making sure that our tools are clean. So we want to make sure that our tools are clean, especially when we're handling or cutting suspected diseased plant material. So one thing that's general good rule of thumb, always have clean tools between properties or between gardens. So you want to make sure that you're not bringing a potential disease from one person's garden into another person's garden if you're using the same tools. So that means removing all dirt matter that's on the shovels, that's on the pruners or on the trowels or whatever. Make sure there's no dirt that comes with you to the new site. And then that means that also you're spraying those tools either with isopropyl alcohol, or you're soaking them in a diluted bleach solution, or doing something that's going to kill any potential fungal or bacterial or viral disease that might be on the plants. So I like using isopropyl alcohol if you just make sure that there's no actual dirt on the tools and there is just the clean metal. Just spraying with the alcohol, make it nice and wet, let it kind of evaporate on its own, then you're pretty darn set. So I always keep a spray bottle of isopropyl alcohol with me in my garden or in the car if I'm going to another site to do that and to make sure that my tools are always clean between landscapes. But you also want to think of this in terms of between plants. And so if the landscape is extremely healthy and you have really no concerns about it, maybe spraying before and after you're done in a landscape is fine. But if there's any suspicion of disease, or if you're handling plants or pruning plants that are prone to disease like manzanitas or ceanothus, or prone to particular fungal diseases, you want to make sure that you're pruning sometimes either right before and after that plant, or if there's actual disease evidence on the plant, you're pruning between, you're disinfecting between cuts. So there's a dead branch on a manzanita, you cut that, you spray your pruners right after that before you cut anything else. Because the one thing you don't want to do is cut a diseased branch and then carry potential disease to a healthy branch, and then that part of the plant starts dying. Or cut one disease and then go to a new plant, and now that new plant starts getting the disease. So you want to make sure that you're disinfecting between cuts anytime you suspect disease, anytime there's dead material that isn't just natural, normal kind of deadheading dead material, but we're talking about a whole branch dies back. Or there's, I suspicion, I don't know why this plant is dying. And you cut that, assume it's diseased, spray those shears. You can also submerge, in boiling water if this is from your house. If you want to use heat, that's fine. Or fire, but I probably wouldn't risk with fire. All right. So someone asked about treating the open wound of a tree, the scar from a large pruning cut. I normally don't. I think it probably depends on the circumstance and the situation. If there's a lot of potential disease opportunity, you might consider it. If it's a time of year where it's the weather is not dry, it's really kind of moist, and the likelihood of fungal disease infecting the plant is higher, than maybe. But I've not personally done that or really needed to, but it's possibly applicable. So tool references, bypass pruners. So I just call them hand pruners. But hedge shears are these big kind of bunny ear ones. So this is where you make those, box hedges. Loppers for larger diameter branches than you could handle with a pruner. Sometimes they have telescoping kind of handles so you can reach tall places. Hand saw. So this is a really nice brand called Silky, and it's, I think, a Japanese brand, and this is called a Big Boy. And then they have like I don't know if it's called Little Boy or Small Boy or something like that. They have various sizes. This is an excellent saw. I personally use it myself, and very, very good quality. Long-armed pruners, so from very far away. You can prune things. Pole saw pruner, again, this is usually telescoping. You can extend the arm of it, and I have a hard time with these. I have a hard time getting like a good enough kind of grip over what I need, but this is very, very commonly used for people who do tree work. A machete. If you're really brave, you can use one of these to hack through high brush. I didn't know this was here until this moment. So you can use this. I mean, it's totally useful. This is not going to give you precision, and this is more, I think, if you just want to, you can probably coppice with this. Hula hoe, collinear and standard hose. So your hose are going to be the things that help you with weeding often. And so for instance, the hula hoe, when I talked about using a tool to scrape just under the soil surface and kind of cut the weed at the base, these are the tools that you could use for that. So this is going to be a little bit more about weeding. It does disturb the surface of the soil a little bit, so you have to be a little bit careful how you use it. A bow rake, a leaf rake, and a landscape rake. So your bow rake for moving hard, you can do mulch, you can move gravel with that. Leaf rake obviously is for lightweight things. So it's usually plastic or wire metal. That's a little less, firm on the ground. It's not a hard metal surface, so you can scrape things that are softer. And then a landscape rake, again, this is good for smoothing out. You could still do, smooth out gravel or DG. You can flip it upside down usually and get like a real smooth surface from that. And it's usually very wide as well. All right, a spade and a trenching shovel. So spade also, this flat shovel, also called a transfer shovel. So this is for transferring material from one place to another. It's not necessarily for digging a hole for a plant. And if you want to dig a hole for a plant, or you want to dig a hole for trenching, you can use a trenching shovel or just one of the shovels that have a pointier tip. But this trenching shovel is really good when you need to make a trench. And it's usually actually a really good size for just 1 gallon pots that you are trying to plant. So I have a trenching shovel for my regular planting needs. Rounded shovel. So this again is your typical shovel for making the hole in the ground for your pot. Potted plant. A post hole digger, also useful for smaller plants or for digging holes for posts. That's the purpose of that one. I don't really use this personally. You might find this is not as applicable depending on your work. Square shovel, again, there we go. Square shovel for usually transferring materials from one to another, not for digging deep holes, because again, you have a flat end on it. A mattock pick, so this again for breaking up hard surfaces. You can use this for this flatter end is kind of useful for thick rooted weeds. So if in the case of, say you have maybe even like a shrubby weed or something like castor bean or any of those like bigger, taller, rootier weeds, you might need something a little bit more heavy duty. A hori is becoming a very popular tool. Also, you can say it's a shovel knife. It basically can be used as a shovel, can be used as a weeding tool, can be used as a knife. It's just a very kind of highly versatile garden tool that's people who use swear by it and are never without it. I've never used one personally. I mean, I've used one, I just don't have it as part of my arsenal of tools. But many people like them. Chainsaw, obviously, when you're cutting really big pieces of wood. You can get smaller chainsaws. You can get electric chainsaws that aren't as heavy duty, depending on your needs. And generally speaking, the more you can back off of gas-powered tools, the better. They're going to start banning the sale of them in California. And even though the electric counterparts are not usually as powerful, I think that the benefit of the reduction in air pollution is far more important than some lack of efficiency. So I think if you can buy electric tools, that would be preferable. And if you can do things by hand versus any kind of power tool, even that is preferable. Takes a little more time, but ultimately you've saved on air pollution, noise pollution, and the like. A string trimmer or a weed whacker. This one you can get electric. I have a battery operated one. It goes about couple hours, I think, without another battery charge, this particular one model that I got. And otherwise was pretty powerful. For people who have to be out all day long doing it, maybe gas powered is the way to go. But again, this is for your weed whacking, hacking stuff down, mowing. You can use this on the epilobium. So this is where you can coppice grasses. You can coppice epilobium with this. I wouldn't use this to coppice Matilla poppy. That's way too thick. So you would need to use your actual hands for that, or a tool for that one. Hedge trimmer. This will cut small, very thin branches and leaves, so you can get that repeated hedging. But if it's a thick branch, this will not cut it. Power pole chainsaw. So this is a chainsaw on a pole that's either battery operated or otherwise. So I have a plug-in one of this. So as long as you have a nice extension cord, it's a really, really useful tool for cutting branches that are high up in trees. I prefer it over the pole saw, the hand pole saw, just because, again, I'm not that good at the hand pole saw. And an electric leaf blower. So this is also just for cleanup. If you can use a rake and a broom, if this isn't a time issue, and if you can market yourself as a landscaper that uses as quiet tools as possible, you can just use brooms and rakes in lieu of a leaf blower. However, an electric leaf blower, while nowhere near as powerful as a gas-powered leaf blower, is good enough to clean off pathways and all of that without the pollution, without the horrible emissions that those gas-powered leaf blowers create. So that's one of the parts of the industry. Unfortunately, the gas-powered tools, the lawnmowers and the leaf blowers, that's been, those emissions have been pretty unregulated for a really long time. They actually emit more than cars do. And it's one of the most polluting things that we have allowed to exist. And then it's also just something to keep in mind, depending on where you are, it's quite noisy. With electric leaf blower is much quieter, but a broom or a rake is even far quieter than that. So just keep in mind that we've kind of normalized, for some reason, a level of noise in regular residential life that is quite unusual. That if somebody stood on somebody's lawn and yelled with the same decibel continuously for 10 minutes straight or 20 minutes straight, no one would tolerate it. Nobody, they'd be calling the police. But somehow we've completely normalized these like obscenely loud tools that all they're doing is blowing leaves around. And you can hear it in most residential neighborhoods. You're hearing it every single day of the week. Somebody's got some like hideously loud noise machine going off in a yard because nobody can stand having a speck of a leaf on the ground. So just, see if your own garden kind of strategy could phase out this kind of noisy equipment whenever possible. It's not always possible, but see when you can do that. Definitely the polluting equipment, phase that out. But after that, the noise pollution, see if you can phase that out too. All right, and I see that the chat is going up, so I'm gonna, after the tools, I will look at the chats and answer questions. A soil probe, so this can be used to check the soil and actually take like a sample of the soil and see exactly where the moisture is. Irrigation adjustment tools, I haven't used the one on the right, but this guy on the left, this is used for the MP rotators, so they will change, help kind of like make adjustments to the sprinkler head. So you might find this is something that you're using often. Dram watering nozzle with a wand. You don't always have to use a wand. I actually just attached this this dram watering head to the hose itself, but you can definitely use the wand if it's more helpful. one thing that is required for hand watering by LADWP, but it's also just a good practice in general, is having some form of on and off. So this little hand piece will, turn it on and then release it to not run the water. So you don't want the water continuously running. You can also get little brass shutoff valves that you can attach to your hose and then just attach. That's what I do, is have a brass shutoff valve. It just has a little handle that you turn it on and off, and then I put this little red guy on the end here. Dram is a pretty good brand. This particular nozzle is something called the Dram, I think 1000 water breaker nozzle, and it has 1000 holes on it. So it really gives this really beautiful shower. And if you have high kind of water pressure, and it can really send water very, very far, and you can water a lot of landscape with it and give it a real rain shower kind of feel. So this is my go-to kind of nozzle. All right, so I'm gonna check the chat real quick. Let's see. All right. So big boys, how much are they, and do they sell them at Theodore Payne? That's a good question. They don't sell them at Theodore Payne that I've seen. And I don't remember exactly how much it costs, but if you check on Amazon and look up Silky Saw Big Boy, Silky, I think is the brand, SILKY, Saw Big Boy, and you'll see they have the various kinds. I don't think you have to get them on Amazon. It's possible you can get them elsewhere, but that might just give you a good price check. But that's kind of my favorite. Oh, I didn't know that. Okay, so hori hori means dig, dig in Japanese. Jack says he's hori hori curious. Good to know. Big fan. Emily's a hori hori enthusiast. Baron says doesn't see a definite need for any of those machines or gas-powered tools. I agree. It's become it's partially because we've become a culture that doesn't understand kind of the ecological cycle of life. Leaves have become something of like, don't let any dead leaves exist on the ground. But the reality is it just sweep them off of your hardscape into the areas of dirt and allow them to decompose naturally as a mulch. Not all leaves make the best mulch, but in general, allowing leaves, that whole phrase, leave the leaves. You leave the leaves for wildlife. You leave the leaves to allow that natural decomposition process to happen, to be able to feed the fungi that decompose it, to release it and process it in a way that it becomes something nutritious that plants can then uptake. So it's a whole life cycle, and we've fixated on aesthetics over ecology as a society, and because of that, we've invented tools and normalized tools that are killing us literally with the amount of pollution they create. So it's an unfortunate thing that we're hoping that this classes like this and movements like this and people like you can start to push back on and to try to model something better. All right, so somebody says leaf vacuums are better for not distributing particulates. So that's another good point about the blowers. The blowers, so they create air pollution in the form of the exhaust from gas to just blow a bunch of can be harmful to inhale, and you might not notice them because it's not. And if you guys lost me, my internet connection is unstable. So can you guys hear me? Because I think my internet, okay, we're good.
You again, you jumped out for a second, but you're back.
Okay, thank you. All right, I will keep going. Let's see, what else do we have? Oh, some cities are starting to ban leaf blowers. Yes, I would like all of them banned. Made a comment that the steel on the hand saws, the loppers, and the pruners are so high quality. Steel, I'm sure, matters, and sometimes without how many leaves you're dealing with. But the premise is that leaves, if you leave them in an area where they can naturally decompose, they eventually start to feed into the kind of the life cycle of the soil. We're not suggesting that you leave leaves on pathways and sidewalks or on streets, but raking them, moving them, even if you need to get them off site, doing them in a way that doesn't pollute is preferential, or I don't know if that's the word, preferable. Oh, let's see. Oh, silky saws, somebody. To that. Jack says, avoid giving Bezos more money. So see if you can find that not on Amazon. Sells. All right, everyone said can't hear you. Jack is correcting Bezos, Jeff Bezos, not Besos, not kisses in Spanish. He believes in kisses, just not Jeff Bezos. All right. Okay, so we're gonna move on. I apologize if I get out of connection. In your book, so on the off chance we don't get to it, remember that it's there. You guys have all this information. Okay. Manzanitas, the season is early spring that you prune it, because you're trying to not prune off the flower buds. Prune when it's hot and dry, not when it's moist. So that's for manzanitas. Same thing for the ceanothus. And keep in mind, if you cut into wood that's too thick, you it's much more prone to getting fungal infection. So you want to keep those. Sages is more just to rejuvenate them and to shape them. Tip pinching, remember, is really good in the early heading back. Ground covers, you can edge them, but remember, edge them in that variable way. Don't edge them just in one straight line. And so additional opportunities for you as a landscaper, depending on what your skill set is, annual tree pruning might be something that you offer. And so, but you don't want to do heavy tree pruning annually on most trees in general. The less that you can do is better. So this would be more just for like tidying up or clearing something, maybe structurally, not as a regular thing. And so contractor to do that for you, but make sure that you're using pruning bring for disinfecting your shears and saws, and you are not doing it during bird nesting season. Fire zone modification. So for brush clearance, rather than have just anyone do it, if you can offer this service and do it in a way that's thoughtful to the native land, But if you can do it in a way that's a little bit more thoughtful, that might be something that will work. And again, if my internet goes wonky, ugh. All right. All right, last slide before I go out completely. You're going to want to, there's two options here. You're going to want to sort the flashcards into groups with similar pruning needs, and you can use your maintenance handout to assist with the sorting. So in your handbook, you have many pages of maintenance notes per species. Or per genus, depending on the and so you're going to either sort the flashcards into groups with similar pruning needs, and you can use your maintenance handout, or assess a native plant and determine the best course of pruning given its condition and aesthetic. So one is slightly easier than the other, but it depends on whether or not you have native plants to assess in real life. If you're going to do the assessing a native plant, or if you're going to do flashcards into groups, perhaps it makes sense to do 5, 5, 5, 5 that can do coppicing, 5 that can do that you would do shearing, 5 that you can do thinning, etc. So you can list those and send those. The picture, let me see it, and then assess its condition and aesthetic. So if you see this overgrown, maybe I don't know, elderberry with half of it looking dead, you can show me a picture and say, I would prune off all the dead wood, I would thin some of the branches, I would, make it look tighter, etc. So just describe how you would prune a particular native plant. That could be a tree as well. So could be trees, could be a grass, etc. So just assess the native plant, determine the best course of pruning, and send that to me at wildergardens@gmail.com. And that is our last slide. And if I don't cut out completely, yes, I apologize for the glitches. And asked about parking info for Sunday. So for anyone who's going to be attending, remember the Westwood Greenway, that's this Sunday? Is that this Sunday? Yeah, that's this Sunday. This coming Sunday. Charles, if you want to, you could respond in the chat or verbally, that's fine.
Yeah, this Sunday, 1 o'clock, the RSVP thing is set up with the link that I sent previously. If I don't have it handy, but if you go to the Facebook page, LA Native, there's a link on there where you can RSVP. LA Native Plants on Facebook will get you there. Thank you, and love to see everybody there. Should be fun.